So I think we'll go ahead and get started. I actually feel like what would make the most sense is to start where we just left off, which is you've been writing a lot about big tech. Obviously, AI is AIing, and there's a lot of talk about an AI bubble. So all these kind of like floating topics. I want to start really broad. So when you talk about it being a tough year because of Trump and AI, let's start with the AI part of that equation. Why has your job been both necessary but difficult this particular year as it relates to AI?
Well, AI is. I'm not sure it's just me necessarily. I think a lot of people have experienced lots of anxiety around AI this year, just because I think for various reasons that it's been. On the one hand, there's people having economic concerns about it. The fact that people's jobs are on the line and that kind of thing. I think that's one element of the concern. I think the other element of the sort of anxiety-inducing element of AI is just sort of seeing how the oligarchy kind of works, just sort of seeing this naked power of the tech sector and how they just got this total inside line into the administrations around the world. And so I think the sheer level of potential inequality in our society and the sheer political power that the tech lords wield, I think is also anxiety inducing for many people. Even if their own jobs aren't particularly threatened or something like that, I think just seeing that kind of political power of this tiny, tiny class of people is concerning for lots of people, having to see their face everywhere, having to listen to Elon's hot takes, whether you want to or not, it's just like kind of obnoxious, this sort of endless, being exposed to this tiny clique of people who, might be narrowly talented in what they do, but really shouldn't be seen as like the world's philosophers.
Yeah. Or Time People of the Year.
Exactly. So I think, that's also been, but obviously for me, if I'm writing about this kind of thing, I don't only write about tech, I also write about money and finance, things like that, but, or capitalism more broadly. But, I think it's been a big topic. And then, of course, the fact that it's then got tied into the world of Trump, where, part of that kind of no holds barred kind of competitive death fight kind of mentality that's been promoted, so the fact that he's sort of thrown his weight behind the tech sector in this imagined like battle for global domination and stuff. So he's kind of all got tied in. So, at the same time, it's also fascinating. I personally think the AI thing will crash very, very hard, but who knows when that's going to happen.
Yeah. I recorded an episode with Cory Doctorow, and that'll come out later, like early next year. And his kind of like hot take claim was that he doesn't even think in 5 years there will be any foundation models on the internet. Like he believes there'll be plenty of, proliferation of open source communities and people still using machine learning tools within this broad nebulous bucket of AI, but that these foundation models that are run, using this vast data center infrastructure, there's just not a viable price point where that's actually worth it and where it can pay off the money that's already been sunk into it. What's your kind of like take looking at that? Because this connects to that AI bubble narrative as well.
I'll just mirror Cory's take. I respect Cory a lot. He's got a lot of deep knowledge on that. The thing about, I haven't been doing any deep analysis of the actual stock prices or whatever of the AI world. But one thing I know is that, capitalism as a system has these almost automatic processes. At least this is the way that I would see it, So when I'm looking at the kind of tech CEOs, often, the sort of public, or at least the public perception that they like to try to cultivate is that they're these sort of heroic individuals who are visionary and, boldly striding forth into the future. When I look at them, it's like everything you do is so predictable. You're like a avatar. It's like you have no agency, actually. Capitalism is actually very, very predictable, like what it does. It's, and you can just see it's like they're in a kind of like death match against each other, desperately trying to claw for, processing power and stuff. But in a way, when you look at them, it's kind of like they actually don't have agency. And I think this is I quite like to make this inversion with billionaires, because, we have this narrative that they somehow lead the society and they somehow have all this power. But in reality, when you actually watch them, they all behave exactly how you predict they would behave. So when I'm looking at, their sort of all-out kind of rush, there's a certain kind of irrationality to it. It makes sense in the short term, but if you look into the long term, you're like, does this actually add up? And in a way, it doesn't matter if it adds up or not, because it's not like they actually have a choice but to act like this in the short term. They feel like they have no choice. They feel like if they do this, they will be destroyed by somebody else. All right. So they have this kind of almost automatic way of behaving, which they then try to cloak or like disguise as like visionary future forward looking. But they're looking about like maybe 3 years ahead. Right, like never mind, 30 years ahead. If I was betting on it, I'd say that I would bet on a massive analog resurgence in the next 20 years. Personally,
I feel like we're already seeing that. Like I know,
but I think it's just unsustainable. Like what they're trying to do.
Totally. Well, I think there's a couple angles to that. One, I see a big backlash to AI generated content, broadly speaking, particularly among young people. But also what you're describing with AI, like where AI fits in the capitalist narrative, it's essentially just an accelerant. But kind of to Corey's point and to your point, it's not actually it's not railroads. It's not actually delivering this very easily recoupable value. Like a recent study by OpenRanker and A16Z analyzing 100 trillion tokens, which is both a lot and far less than actually, have been called in the sort of recent history of AI, found that far and away the primary use case for generative AI tools is role playing, which brings a lot of like ambient value into people's lives, but there's likely not an addressable market there that's going to pay off the $600 billion that's been sunk into it.
Yeah. I think you're probably right.
Yeah, well, we'll find out. Anyway, we spent
the ability to put on a big short. Wait, I mean, I'm interested. Like, if I was a hedge fund manager, how I would go about doing a massive, massive short of the AI market. I mean, I'm not sure. There's probably ways of doing it, but it probably quite costly. Maybe I should try and. I see that Michael Burry from the guy from the you know The Big Short, the film.
Totally, of course.
He's now on Substack. He's got a new Substack that's out. Maybe he's the guy to ask. It's like, how would you put on a massive long-term short against the AI industry? Maybe you can get like Deutsche Bank or these people to like write some kind of swap contract to do it. But I think in the long term, I would do that. But of course, in the short term, no. Again, it's this thing about the chronic lack of agency under an actual capitalist system. If you go to all the fund fund managers right now, all of them feel like they have to be in it, because if they're not, they're going to lose out in the short term. Even though all of them collectively know that they're kind of like screwed, that there's an AI bubble, but they feel like they can't act against it. Right? So there's a lot of this sort of short-term idiocy going on. Yeah. So
having covered this so extensively for so long, this is a question that's going to sound elementary, but it's one I wrestle with a lot, is like, even down to the fundaments of capitalism, like the idea that we can't endlessly compete. There are not finite resources on this planet. Endless accumulation has a clear, obvious sort of end game to it. What is your read on what they're telling themselves about that? Like, why is that not something that's patently obvious to them too, the way it's patently obvious to you?
To who? Sorry,
to you. Like these hedge fund managers and CEOs and billionaires who are like continuing to play this game. Is it your assumption that they're just ignoring the idea that this game is going to come to an end and crash down everybody's heads? Like, what is it that's causing them to be this way?
Well, I can't speak for all of them. Obviously, there's nuance within human groups, and obviously there's going to be differences between them. But yeah, bear in mind, these guys are all immersed in a very particular cultural setting. If you're sitting in the middle of Silicon Valley, surrounded by a bunch of other people who have the same wealth and same status and same sense of normality as you can very quickly, like, I'm probably being a bit reductionist here, but human beings aren't actually that complicated. Like, you sort of want acceptance from your peer group and stuff, and they're probably measuring themselves against each other. They want to be able to go to the cocktail party with each other and not feel like the loser and stuff like that. So they're kind of in this. To them, it probably feels like normality. Like it's a sort of. I've always been a bit of an outsider, right? So I tend to have this natural default tendency to step outside of groups, right? Which gives me a certain ability to see through groupthink, at the expense of obviously sometimes lacking inclusion in groups, right? But lots of people who get a kick out of being included in particular social groups, they don't want to challenge what the group says. So I suspect there's a lot of just like ordinary human stuff going on in the billionaire class, where they just want to be able to hang out with their mates and say that they're doing the same thing, and they don't want to hear stories about you saw this a lot in the crypto markets. Like, the idiotic stuff that would happen in the crypto markets was just like amazing. Yeah, these highly intelligent people doing the most stupid, like imagining the most ridiculous things, and actually collectively not imagining that it wasn't ridiculous, because they're all around each other in a kind of a bubble, in a cultural group, and they've all convinced each other that this thing's like a reality. So I suspect in that tech sector right now, it's probably, if you're within it, if you're sitting in the middle of that AI thing, you probably can't see outside of it. You really, really believe your own kind of bullshit, maybe. So I don't know. That's one angle in it.
Yeah, makes total sense. Okay, so
they got to undermine their entire identity to see through their own bullshit, in a way. It's like, and they kind of don't want to do that. Like, sometimes when I look at Mark Zuckerberg, he's a particularly interesting character. This because he just like he has the most cringe visions of innovation and stuff. You just look at him, you're like, wow, like this is supposedly this kind of brilliant, kind of innovative individual. And yet some of the stuff he comes up with is so utterly banal and so kind of cringe. And you're sort of like, I sort of sometimes I feel kind of sorry for him in a way.
Yeah, I'm thinking about a related cringe character that you've also brought up. There's that viral snippet going around of Elon Musk on Joe Rogan's podcast talking about how great it is to have Grok roast people at a party. And it's just so indicative of like, oh, you don't even know how to be normal and like tell jokes with your friends. And like, it would never even occur to you to just like try to be funnier. You like try to actually develop that human skill yourself so you don't need Grok. It's like childishly embarrassing. It's not even like elite billionaire with their powerful tools embarrassing.
No, exactly. It's like they're very fragile. Yeah. I think this is why I'm always quite keen to invert these narratives about billionaire power, because often they're very, very fragile people who've ended up in a position of power through, again, if you're somebody like Mark Zuckerberg, basically you're just a human being like anybody else, right? There's nothing particularly different about you. You happen to have found yourself in a particular, being swept up by processes beyond your control, essentially. Right. So when like, when I say this kind of stuff, I'm sort of channeling a bit of a slightly Marxist-y sort of systemic theory kind of vibe, right? Like the capitalist system doesn't care about Mark Zuckerberg. It doesn't, give a shit, about these individual people. It's like, okay, like what's going to enable expansion and acceleration in a system, right? Something like Facebook at that point, at some point in the economic in our economic reality was almost like selected in a sense. It's something that could scale stuff up, right? And Mark Zuckerberg happened to be a person who's there. All right. So he gets carried along with the systemic process and becomes a billionaire. And then he finds himself as this kind of like fragile individual who's arbitrarily been selected to be in this position of power. And he's now trying to like act out this, and Elon's the same thing. If you actually interact with this person or look at him, he's just like this kind of random guy. I actually, I'm from South Africa. So whenever I see Elon, I just see this kind of sort of confused white South African. So, and I imagine his background as well. And I imagine him being at school in this like, in Pretoria, where I think he grew up. And it was like in the 1970s where I think he was growing up. I could totally imagine what it'd be like to be a kind of nerdy person like him in this like authoritarian, hardcore macho country, and how that might have shaped his sort of kind of personality and mentality. I actually I kind of feel sorry for him, when I look at him. So I'm kind of
I like that take.
I'm just riffing, yeah.
No, I love it. I think people really need to hear this. Like, it sounds, you're sitting with these thoughts all the time, so it sounds simple to you, but I think a lot of people, there's a lot of inbuilt fear and this sense that there's more going on, and we need people like you to cut through and be like, no, they're just these fragile people who are in this like position of preposterous power, and they're not using it well, or they're using it in ways that are both destructive and just very cringy at a very elemental level. I want to.
The first time I really aware of this was the first time I became aware of this was that I worked in the financial sector, and this was around during the financial crisis, actually. And actually, during the financial crisis time, or before that, there was all these sort of bad boy stories, like pop finance books that were coming out. People like Michael Lewis were writing about. They wrote Liar's Poker, these different books that were about sort of bad boy finance character, right? And there's this whole kind of genre of books and films, The Wolf of Wall Street, these kind of films, all about this sort of kind of supervillain characters in finance. And the reality is, if you ever actually met these people in finance, they were just like so random. Like they were kind of just ordinary people, right? And they'd, again, found themselves in positions of extraordinary power because the financial sector sits at the apex of the global economy, right? And there's only so many people that you need in that apex. So if you happen to be one of the people who finds yourself there, you could get given a huge amount of power, but you can be like totally arbitrary, like who you are. And so you'd find these people who actually were quite, emotionally immature, or just ordinary people who then almost you could sort of sometimes feel them acting out the cliche of what they thought they were supposed to be in that situation. So almost like being like, oh yeah, I am a bad boy, like, top financier. And in reality, you can see they emotionally weren't convinced that they actually were that person, but they were sort of trying to act it out. And I suspect right now that same thing's happening to lots of the tech people. They've now become the sort of like supervillain, bad boy characters. I'm sure there's a bunch of pop writers about to write books about all the sort of AI engineers and stuff. But it's quite similar to the sort of, finance bro literature and sort of like, mentality in a way. So, yeah.
Yeah, makes total sense. But enough about them.
There actually are some supervillains. I mean, they do exist, some of them. But most people in these elite positions are random.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it can be both. It's you can end up in this position, and your insecurity then causes you to, whether advertently or not, you sort of become a supervillain by perpetuating a system that is harming so many at a faster and faster pace.
Yeah, yeah. And actually, you feel that with people like Mark Zuckerberg. You feel like he's got trapped in a position and he doesn't quite know what to do. So he's now going to like lean into being this sort of kind of a character that in a film would be a supervillain.
Totally. With his what is it, MMA training.
Yeah,
Um,
he's gonna do that.
but anyway, we spent plenty of time talking about the oligarchs, and that'll weave its way back in. But I want to spend a little bit of time talking about you specifically and your work. So obviously, a lot of people here are very familiar, but there might be some folks from my end who aren't as familiar with your work. So if you could give a brief overview of who you are and what you're trying to do with Asimoko.
Yeah. So yeah, I'm Brett Scott. I mean, I basically have originally I come from an anthropology background, from a sort of an academic perspective. Then I worked in the financial sector, but also have always been involved in forms of activism, kind of left-wing political activism. So I had my original sort of persona was this kind of mix of technical finance meets left-wing activism stuff. And then my first book was about that. And that was called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. And that came out after Occupy Wall Street protests, to basically help civil society, or people, activists, members of the public, to think about how do you combat the power of finance? How do you design alternatives? How do you, jam the financial sector in various ways? And so that was kind of my sort of first incarnation, my first public incarnation, should I say. But then I started writing a lot more about money, or let's say, like stuff like hedge funds and investment banks are the kind of world of high finance, right? But I became a lot more interested in like low finance, the sort of everyday type of thing, and people's everyday experiences of money and the sort of stuff that gets overlooked a lot. So I started looking a lot more at the monetary system, and I started writing about the issue of cashless society. Right? So people's payments choices, whether using physical money or digital money. And at the same time, I was also getting more involved in sort of analyzing the tech sector. So my second book was looking at how there was this fusion between big finance and big tech going on, and how that was manifesting at a sort of small scale cultural or like everyday realm as this attack on the physical cash system, right? As a sort of increased cultural demonization of the cash system. And these processes where people would be made to feel ashamed about using physical cash. So that was my second book, Cloudmoney. That came out 2022. But I started the Substack in 2020. And one of the original things I was always interested in with my Substack was to visualize these processes, because I think quite a lot of people are visual learners. And I'm quite visual in the way I approach. So I wanted to find these sort of ways to take invisible systems and make them visible in various ways, right? To sort of draw pictures of the monetary system, I've had different degrees of success with that over time, but over time I've been nuancing that out, building that, increasing my kind of repository of imagery that I'm sort of will use to explain the global economy. And that's basically, that's kind of my main thing. Yeah.
Amazing. And I want to pick up with Cloudmoney and the idea of cashless societies. You've both in that book and obviously throughout Asimoko have talked about why that's not the amazing innovation that it's being proclaimed to be, and that it's in fact dangerous to the everyday person. Could you speak a little bit to that?
Yeah, I mean, Cloudmoney was looking at, look, there's a bunch of pro-cash people in the world who come from a right-wing perspective for various reasons, right? There's, in some forms of libertarianism and stuff, you'll find this idea of the sort of looming government, big brother coming to surveil you and stuff. So there's a bunch of people already writing about cashless society, but from this kind of like more conservative libertarian perspective. Whereas I come from a left-wing perspective. So the way I would be like analyzing it in Cloudmoney is to look at, what's happening in a capitalist system is there are systemic processes going on that are beyond the control of any individual person. Right. And those systemic processes in general tend to be expansion and acceleration. Those are two big systemic processes. So there's this inherent tendency in a large-scale capitalist system for it to sort of default in a way. And like default's quite an important concept here. It's just like, if you don't do anything else, it'll just automatically just default to this course of behavior. And that is things like automation, expansion, acceleration. And in that context, you'll see anything that stands against that starts to get culturally demonized. So there was a point, let's say 200 years ago, when cash would have been at the leading edge of the economy, right? 200 years ago, that was like a kind of thing people were using to expand and accelerate a system, all right? But in the current moment of global capitalism, the cash system is seen as something that's, in a sense, slowing it down, creating drags, creating what they call friction. So there's all this ideology starts to come out, which promotes frictionlessness and so on, and imagines that it's a kind of natural virtue human beings want. Sometimes it comes disguised under the name convenience, right? So stuff like cashless societies starts to get presented as a sort of natural evolutionary process that's occurring, a natural upgrading process that will lead, us closer towards some kind of utopia. And in Cloudmoney, I was dispelling that. For a start, just sort of showing the processes of capitalism to say, the reason why this happens isn't because of individual desire, because what the digital payments industry and stuff will say, they'll say, oh, the reason why we're moving towards digital payments is that ordinary people desire this thing. So they paint this picture of this bottom-up movement that's the source of change in a society. It's the same thing with AI right now. When asked why AI is happening, they'll say, oh, well, because people want this. Ordinary people desire the convenience. That's why this occurs. So they always have these bottom-up stories, which the hero of the story is the ordinary consumer, right? And the reality is that the vast majority of people, when they're experiencing automation processes, neither desire it nor feel like they have any choice, right? They just default to it because they sense they have no other choice. Right? It's actually very similar with digital payments. People just find themselves drifting into it. And these processes will then lead to cultural changes and even psychological changes. So people will actually, over time, start to perceive cash as being inconvenient. But it's an after-the-fact process. It's not a before-the-fact thing that explains why it happens. All right? You only start to perceive these things as being inconvenient once you've been moved into a higher acceleration society where if you're not using it, you start to get penalized, right? So that's basically the kind of, it's, in the context of AI, it'll be something like in 10 years' time or 5 years' time, if you're not using it, you'll start finding it very hard to get a job. You'll start finding it very difficult to get by in society. It's not being driven by approaching desire. It's been driven by a systemic process that's occurring. And you either go with it or you get penalized, right? And so, one of the metaphors I sometimes use is like thinking about whitewater rafting. If you're going down a river on a raft, you may love or hate that process. You might find it exhilarating. You might think it's great, or you might find it terrifying and hate it. But in either case, the reason you're going down river has got nothing to do with your desire, right? You're being pulled down the river whether you want to go or not, right? And I think it's a very similar thing with automation technologies. Like, you may enjoy AI. You might like digital payments. It's true. There are people who actually like this stuff. That's not why it's happening, right? There's a systemic process that's pulling you down into that situation, whether you want to go or not, all right? Now, having said that, that's the sort of default in a system. You can politically organize to override that default. All right. So it is possible to form counterpower to say we're going to create ways of stopping that process. So Cloudmoney was not only looking at that, how our system defaults towards digital money, but it's also saying, you can actually form counterpower. You can actually see past that systemic process and start to think about how would we build more balanced systems. Right. So I hope that made some vague sense, but
absolutely. And I want to actually ask about what some of those interventions are, but before I do, we have a question from, forgive me if I mispronounce this, Stathis. who writes, left-wingers should originally find a balance among merit and human needs, profit and subsidiary economy. What about the Chinese capitalism?
What about the Chinese capitalism? Repeat that question. I was trying to.
Reading it, I'm not totally sure I can get it quite right. It says left-wingers should originally find a balance among merit and human needs, profit and subsidiary economy. What about the Chinese capitalism? I think kind of reading between the lines, it's a question around like what are the intervention points in a system like Chinese capitalism. I think the implication being that that's, you know, a capitalism born of communism rather than a capitalism born of neoliberalism.
Well, I guess, I mean, I don't think I'm not an expert on Chinese capitalism, but you know, in a way, the sort of Chinese model is to try to like wrestle, to steer capitalist processes, right? And yeah, in a sense, you can, you know, if you think about communism as a sort of generic concept, if you rewind back to sort of feudalism, where you have these very fixed systems, where your position in society is quite sort of there's a very hierarchical system, but you kind of have a certain degree of certainty as to what your position is. And then you sort of look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism, where you have this like dissolving of that certainty. You know, you have through various processes, the kind of breakdown of that, and this rise of this incredibly fluid systems. And those fluid systems, which are held together by monetary systems, tend to release these kind of forces into society, a bit like Pandora's box. You sort of release these kind of slightly uncontrollable forces, right, which can haunt people. And in a sense, if you're looking at something like communism, it's a kind of an attempt to sort of almost push those forces back into Pandora's box, and often like failing at that. Right, so you actually can't once those forces come out, you can't like push them back down again. And so I guess the sort of new iterations of Chinese capitalism have sort of accepted that, and now say, okay, let's try to like make strategic interventions and have a sort of like slightly state control or not state steered versions of capitalism. And so, yeah, that's the most profound thing I'm going to be able to say about that right now, because I don't claim to be. I don't want to like bullshit about the Chinese case is very, very complex. So
of course. Thanks for taking it on. Okay, back to Cloudmoney.
Of course, what are capitalism is not just market systems.
Sorry, I know we're on a bit of a lag for posterity. There's at least on my side, there's a bit of a lag. So if I'm biting your line, it's really not intentional. Yeah. I'm trying to find the spot where the sentence ends. I was going to steer us back to Cloudmoney, but I didn't want to. If there was something else you wanted to say about Chinese capitalism.
Well, I was just going to say, you know, capitalist systems are not merely the presence of markets, right? It's a particular capitalist systems are a particular arrangements of relations of production, essentially. You know, this is the kind of like Marxist line on capitalism. You know, your sort of libertarians, they believe capitalism is just it's people who, you know, interact with markets, which is like a really banal way of defining a capitalist system. Capitalist system is all about, you know, who controls what. Right? You know, there's systems where you have small numbers of people basically owning the productive resources of society, who then rent that to everyone else who does the work. I mean, that's the basic model, right? And you can have a state version of that. You can have big interactions between the capitalist class and the state. And in China, that's, you know, that's partly how you should analyze it.
Got it. Great. So back to Cloudmoney. How do we intervene the flow of the rapids heading us toward our destination of seamless, frictionless, cashless societies?
Well, yeah, I mean, look, well, in some ways, just one point to make is that while there are default processes that occur in a capitalist system, that doesn't mean those processes are stable. Right? There's lots of contradictions that emerge from them. So the system can actually start to break when those default processes occur. So sometimes they're just sort of natural things that stop it. For example, in the case of like the monetary system, there is a default process for banks to try to get people away from cash, right? Let's take Bank of America. Bank of America CEO Brian Moynihan basically is openly states, "Hey, we want a cashless society." He's on record saying this. And, he's asked why. It's like, well, because we control the infrastructure. We make money off that system, right? So those, the individual banks like Bank of America push for this in various ways, along with players like Visa and MasterCard and so on. So they're going down that route. But when all of them collectively do it at once, you start to have these contradictions emerge. So while it individually makes sense to these individual players, systemically it can cause a lot of problems. So for example, in our monetary system, when all this gets a bit complex, but if you look at what is cashless money, right? It's basically digital casino chips issued out by the banking sector, right? So the units that we use when you're using your card or when you're using an app are these secondary form of money issued out by banks, right? Best thought of as digital casino chips, right? So if you have a Bank of America account, you're using Bank of America casino chips to pay for things. All right. Now, if you think about casino chips, they are psychologically and legally tethered back to, if you were actually in a casino, you would be able to take those chips back to the cashier and redeem them for cash and leave. Right? It's the same with our digital cashless systems. Psychologically and legally, all those digital units that we're using are tethered back to the cash system. So when all the banks are collectively undermining the cash system, they're actually undermining the very thing that psychologically and legally backs their own systems. Right? So while it individually and myopically makes sense to them, structurally at a systemic level, it doesn't, which is why central banks are being now forced to act on this issue. All right. So central bankers are one reason why, for example, something like cashless society might not happen. It's because they're like, actually, if this actually does occur, we have serious systemic problems in the monetary system that start to emerge. Right. So that's like a kind of a technical topic, but there are like systemic breakages that occur when you let the default processes run. And yeah, if you're trying to form a counterpoint to this, there are a bunch of policy things you can do as well. All right. So, in the case of something like cash, you can call for particular policies that protect acceptance of cash, access to cash, and stuff like that. But also, most importantly, you kind of actually need cultural movements to, in a sense, recast what progress means. Right. And this actually applies to stuff like AI as well, because right now we're under this progress ideology, a way of thinking that assumes that basically progress means ever increasing acceleration and expansion and automation. Right. And that's the sort of how we've trained to think about progress. We're trained to think about progress in terms of like the maximization of speed and the maximization of scale and the maximization of complexity. Whereas actually you can recast progress as being a process of balancing between different things. All right. This is one time I'm trying to explain this. I use this example of bicycles and stairs. All right, which are examples of older systems that are still very, very modern. All right, and which draw upon a different concept of progress, a different concept of how we should arrange society. All right, so while the tech sector pushes out this vision that what we should optimize for is ever-increasing speed, many people in society actually want a balance of things, all right? So I think if you're ever trying to launch a sort of a political counter movement against stuff like cashless society or AI, you've got to draw upon these different concepts of progress. To say, hey, human beings don't only desire speed. We desire more than that. We desire connection. In the tech sector, for example, they're always going on about how bad friction is. No, but what is friction? It's texture. Texture's a good thing. We like texture. We actually enjoy contact. So casting stuff like interaction and contact and texture as just like some sort of negative friction is an ideological position in the tech industry, and we can fight back against that. I'm just kind of like ranting here, so maybe Steve, you.
Oh no, that's amazing. And I'm reminded of you've probably seen this, but there's this little quote from Kurt Vonnegut that makes the rounds every few years, where Kurt Vonnegut's talking about wanting to go pick up something at I forget what type of shop. And his wife is like, well, you can just order that on the internet. And he's like, well, then I don't, interact with the people I see on the sidewalk, and I don't go into the store and see what else is available, and I don't talk to the cashier. Like, that's the full experience that I'm seeking. I'm not just seeking that product.
Yeah. And the complexity of this is that what he's fighting against there is the default. So the default systemic process will be internet, remove friction, and that kind of thing. But at a human level, we don't actually like that. And this shows the mismatch between the systemic imperative and the human experience. Right. And the ideological move made within centers of power is to say that those things are the same. That what human beings desire is that defaulting process. Like, oh, just default to convenience, just default to speed, And it's like, okay, sometimes we like that, but in reality, we like a lot more than that. That's a very, very narrow slice of human experience. Right. And unfortunately, we live in an economic system where it's very, very hard to prioritize anything except that default. And you got to fight really hard to do it. It takes a lot of energy to actually fight for it. So yeah, that's the challenge.
Well, that dovetails very nicely with the origins of this very Substack Live, which was two things happened quite concurrently, and then I commented as such. You had written really beautifully about why transhumanist ideology, first of all, is quite an alien way of thinking, but also is sort of almost anti-human. And I had just written a piece about how Bryan Johnson's "Don't Die," very similarly, is the same force that's kind of rotting and extracting the earth. So let's talk about the transhumanists for a little bit. What's your take on the transhumanists?
Transhumanists. I went to a transhumanist conference like a little while back, several years ago now. It was quite a fascinating experience, actually. Again, going back to that point earlier about the sort of randomness and banality of some of these people, like there was a lot of like powerful people, but who are also just like really sort of socially awkward and nerdy who were there. And I was like, I couldn't help but wonder what the sort of interaction between their personality and why they'd come to this transhumanism thing. So they weren't really super villains. They were just more like a bit sort of I don't know. There was again, I felt sorry for quite a few of them. But yeah, one of the big lines at that conference was death is a disease. And I remember this was one of the big things that people talk about, how death is a disease. And that's when it really was occurring to me. It's just like, wow, such a like kind of there's something very deathly about the conference, because they supposedly were so against death, and yet their sort of solution for death was to try to freeze everything into place. Like remove cycles from existence. Like, we don't want cycles anymore. Like, we're going to be the last generation. It's like, why don't you want any more generations? Why do you want the end of cycles? I mean, like, dynamic processes have cycles. Life has cycles. You don't like cycles. You want just this like frozen type of situation. And it starts to feel actually very like death-like to me. Like, it's like you kind of almost worship death in a way. Like, there's something strange about it. And then, I also went and taught in a couple of times at Singularity University in Silicon Valley, which is a kind of, I don't know if it actually exists anymore, but for a while it was a kind of an institute. Have you ever come across Singularity University?
Of course. I'm actually actually, I didn't know this about your background, and I'm kind of floored that they invited you, because your ideas kind of fly in the face of theirs.
Yeah, and at Singularity, there was a lot of this kind of longevity research vibe going on, and space travel vibe as well. And I was kind of interested by that sort of connection between this. Yeah, and in a way, both of those are all about like this kind of endless expansion. It's like this expansion of life, expansion outwards, expansion. So that and I guess what I was kind of interested at Singularity University was, I'd like to hear your take on it, but it felt almost like a religion that would form in the context of an expanding an economic system that has a default towards expansion. If you wanted a priest class to try and make that process, that defaulting process, holy, in a way, in a capitalist system, it's almost like gravity. It just sort of happens, like but you could have a priest class that worships the gravity and tries to like personify it and say, oh, the gravity is an amazing spiritual force, and you sort of felt that with Singularity quite a lot. Like there was not everybody there. There's some really cool people there, right? But there are some in the background of that institute where you sort of feel like they're kind of a priesthood for expansion, trying to like make expansion, acceleration holy somehow. And so that sort of longevity thing could also be seen in that light, like the sort of like, we want to endlessly extend. And what I find like quite strange about it is, people like Ray Kurzweil and stuff who are very heavily involved in that, they had this kind of vision that somehow as our technology expands and as everything expands, we somehow also expand with it. So somehow our capacity to experience or our capacity to take things in somehow also gets bigger. But that just seemed totally implausible to me. I was like, it's pretty obvious that as we get more stuff, we basically don't have the capacity to actually deal with it. So most of it just gets lost, pouring more water into a bathtub and just watching it just like go through the overflow pipe. It's like you can just throw more and more technology at people, but it's not like they somehow get bigger and bigger and expand and have ever increasing amounts of ability to experience the stuff. So I thought there's something kind of futile at the heart of Singularity, but I'd like to hear your take.
I mean, I think you really poetically nailed it. And I would also call out, I always mix up if it's man or human, and for reasons that'll make sense in the title, but Megan O'Giblin's God, Human, Animal, Machine really breaks down this exact topic. So for folks, I gather you've read it, but for folks who haven't, it really pulls these threads that Brett's pulling around, like this religious fervor around transhumanist ideas, future of life ideas. And yeah, just to maybe add on a little bit of my perspective, because basically co-sign everything you just said. I had to kind of go through the beast to wake up to what it was. My background's in poetry, but to make a long story short, I ended up actually at a startup accelerator in Silicon Valley in 2017. And I always sort of like fashion myself as the person who is really committed to new technologies as ethical interventions into old technologies. And I didn't at the time understand the way that historically that always fails. And of course, nothing is monolithic. I'm sure there are moments that sort of rebut that. But as a general trend, usually that just gets woven into the ongoing acceleration and progress. And it was only, I mean, that's a germ, and there's a long story between then and now, being almost 10 years ago. But being around it is a very infectious energy, because there's a jubilance, there's a sense of possibility about what life could be. So if you're somebody prone to liking sci-fi and liking this kind of imagination, it's a very intoxicating social environment to be around. Not in all cases and not all people, but that general wide open, like the doors blown open, like anything's possible, and we just have to set our human ingenuity to it. And Singularity University is where that force is a little bit more buttoned up, where it's got a little bit more of the, let's say, the rigor, like the Ray Kurzweils, the Peter Diamandis, like those people who are maybe elder statesmen, maybe I like I don't want to, depending on how they feel about elderhood, given their transhumanist aspirations, I don't mean any insult. They're as young as they are. But they're the people who've been really writing really extensively about these ideas. It's not just kind of like off the dome ways of thinking. And yeah, it's really like, it's very easy from the outside to look at that and just be like, oh, like and kind of demonize it. But having gone through it, and I'm curious how you feel about this, having lectured there, you see the appeal of it. Like, you see why so many people gravitate to those ideas, especially as so many other aspects of reality can feel really doom and gloom, rightly and justifiably so. So yeah, that's my response on it's you.
I mean, you probably have more experience than me in that context, but I think there was multiple layers of reality going on at Singularity. On the one hand, it was, for those of you who don't know, Singularity was hosting these programs. I don't know if it still does, but where it brings in all sorts of people from around the world to try to sort of solve problems. And many of those people actually come from quite, rough contexts where actually they're probably not that prone to being caught up in bullshit, so they have sort of practical things they're trying to solve, and they're probably like not that interested in living forever and traveling through space necessarily. But they find themselves in a cultural context where that's sort of like the background quasi-religion. But in a way, there's a lot of like great conversations and stuff at Singularity with people like that who weren't buying fully into the whole kind of backdrop to it. But then in the end, like, if you're sort of, if I was analyzing Singularity in Singularity University context of its sort of ideological function in a system, Silicon Valley in general like specializes in kind of banal first world problems, really. Like, that's often the thing. Like, oh, my taxi took 5 minutes to arrive or something. It's like, oh, like, how utterly banal. Like, this is what you care about. Like, oh, my shopping experience is like a little bit, inconvenient. Like, these are not problems. Right? So in reality, that's actually what gets funded by VCs most of the time in Silicon Valley. But there's a special role for, if you're looking for the sort of utopian imagination around technology, you kind of need the sort of salvation story that it's doing more than that, that it's somehow going to solve all the world's problems. It's going to end poverty. It's going to do all that kind of stuff. And that's, in a way, Singularity University's sort of headline story was like, yeah, we're going to do that, right? And you're right. It can be an intoxicating story for certain types of people, but at an ideological level, at a systemic level, what its role is to act as this kind of smokescreen for the more banal reality of the tech industry, which is that it doesn't really actually try to solve things like that.
Yeah, 100%.
So, but of course, I don't deny that there are many people in the world who, I actually have I'm not immune to technological utopianism. Like, I used to love reading like those old sort of sci-fi comics and stuff where you have people that are exploring the wild cosmos and stuff. Like, of course, we all have some of this element to ourselves, but there's something pathological about the way that imagination is fixated upon in Silicon Valley. There's a particular reason why, all right? And you then also think about what is not being thought about. Why all this fixation upon external things to somehow lead us to transcendence? Of course, the most threatening thing to any like capitalist system is when people say, actually, I just don't really need stuff. That's a terrifying, terrifying thought. It's like, oh, actually, I can just sit and meditate on a hill and that's all I really need. That's basically the end of capitalism.
Well, let's pick up there because you've been writing about MMT, modern monetary theory. And so I want to talk to you about that. But I'm also, I'll put my cards on the table, a strong proponent of post-growth and degrowth. And I'm curious to get your take on those kind of heterodox economic schools. Obviously, that list could get very long. Those are the ones that I gravitate to. Before talking about MMT, if you could just give a flyover definition of what MMT is, like what it entails, so folks are kind of on the same page, and then talk to me about the prospect of intervention with these various forces.
MMT. Okay, I have to get my brain into MMT mode. MMT is a mode of describing the monetary system. At base, that's what it is. A way of describing the monetary system in which, and a particular way of describing the monetary system that flies in the face of traditional descriptions of the monetary system as a kind of commodity. So before you can understand MMT, you have to understand the alternative paradigm, which is basically commodity theories of money. Or actually, let's not say commodity theories. It's like you say commodity orientations to money. So a commodity orientation to money is when you either literally or metaphorically speak about money as if it were a commodity. All right. So actually, if you go to the modern economics discipline, even though economists know that modern money isn't a commodity, they still speak about it as if it is. So they metaphorically speak about it as a commodity, even though they know it's not. Right? So then their mode of description, the way they speak about it, imagines that it's this constrained commodity. Right? And this means they have to have all these weird like workarounds when they deal with the reality, which is that it's not a commodity. MMT goes against that, just says we should just describe the reality of what money is, which is that it's not a commodity. It's issued into existence and pulled out again. Right? That's the sort of starting point of all MMT analysis. It's not only MMT. This goes back like 100 years, right? It's called chartalism. So, and it comes out of, credit, basically seeing money as a system of credit rather than seeing money as a commodity. Now, that's a huge topic in itself, sort of credit thinking versus commodity thinking of money. But MMT basically comes out and says, if you're going to describe the monetary system, talk about one of the big things is that states will spend money into existence and then pull it out later through taxation. They don't need to tax first to be able to spend because they are a money issuer. One of the ways to think about that is to think about, squirrels and oak trees. Like, so when we interact with the monetary system, we're very much like squirrels. We sort of see money as this external object you got to try and like gather up and collect, right? And maybe you can move it around, but you don't perceive that you're not the issuer of it. Squirrels don't, they find acorns, whereas an oak tree is an acorn issuer. So the oak tree has no desire to collect acorns. The oak tree wants squirrels to take its acorns, right? Very similar to money issuers don't want to keep their own money. They want to issue it out. Right? So states are like this. They don't want their own money. They want you to take their money. Right? That's how they get their power.
Take my money.
So MMT basically starts with that basic observation, which is like money issuers don't need to collect their own money to be able to spend. They issue money. All right? But then there's a whole bunch of things come from that starting point about what the true constraints in an economy are. And particularly the true constraints in an economy are actually real resources rather than money. Right? So in an MMT framework, if you're analyzing an economy, you're actually trying to analyze you're not saying stuff like, oh, how will we find money or where do we have enough money? You're asking, do we have enough resources and people? Right? That's the actual question. It's not something like, oh, is there enough money for this thing? It's like the money can be created. That's not the issue. Right? The issue is you will create inflation by issuing too much money into a situation that can't absorb it. Right? That's kind of a Keynesian type perspective as well. I can elaborate more if you want. And
please? I'd love that.
There's political implications to it as well, because conservatives tend to try to generate. One of the reasons why conservatives like commodity imagery around money, even though it's inaccurate, is it constrains the imagination. if you have a metaphorical way of seeing money as a commodity, you imagine that it's constrained, and then you're quite susceptible to these stories that say things like, we can't fund education. Of course, when the banking sector needs bailing out, suddenly the money is found, as though suddenly it's there. But when you need education, oh no, it's not there anymore. It's so. There's particular political uses to commodity theories of money or commodity orientations to money that conservatives historically use. This is why it's considered threatening to have an alternative description of the monetary system, because it opens up the political imagination in a way that's dangerous, what's seen as dangerous by conservatives. And bear in mind, the financial sector and these players, if you're in the business of being a creditor, you also prefer people to have this perception of money as a constrained commodity, right? Because if you hold a constrained thing that everyone else needs, it gives you power. So the creditor class in general likes commodity theories of money, even though all of them know that money isn't a commodity. Ideologically, it's helpful for them to cast money as a commodity because it creates that constraint imagination, which gives them power. And interestingly, the Bitcoin world has an ideological function within this as well.
Say more, please.
All the bankers and stuff, for example, know that Bitcoin can't challenge their systems, but ideologically they like it because it helps to teach teenagers how to think in commodity terms and have that austerity mindset, which transfer ideological power to the creditor class society, right? Under the guise of this revolutionary, decentralized money for the people, right? It's like a sort of if you had to imagine people like Margaret Thatcher or Ronald Reagan and stuff trying to, if they were trying to go around and push conservative economists to teach stuff to kids, that'd be a very hard sell. Kids don't want to listen to conservative old economists. But you sort of put it in the guise of this kind of technological revolution that's so exciting. It's a very good way to spread that ideology. So, Bitcoin's had a very powerful function in spreading conservative ideas about money among younger people, which go against their interests, actually. Right, because if you think about who is the actual creditor class in society, they're old people, right? So when you have your this is getting a bit obscure right now. I'm aware of that, but
no, it's great.
When when your creditor class has power, it doesn't help young people, right? That means they basically have to suck up to the older generation to get the supposedly limited money from them, right? And so things like Bitcoin have this ideological function of kind of teaching the sort of conservative way of thinking in the monetary system, and perversely doing so without ever actually challenging the monetary system, which remains as the normal monetary system remains as strong as it's ever been, right? So it's not like Bitcoin actually authentically challenges that system. So its main function has been to actually spread conservative ideology about money.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
How do you see central bank digital currencies fitting? Oh, sorry.
Oh, well. So, Karen.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, I was just saying that the kind of perverse thing in the Bitcoin world is it comes packaged as a kind of popular revolution. The actual beneficiaries of that thinking are elites.
Classic. Same old song. But this brought up something that I was curious to ask you about prior to the conversation, which is we saw a lot of activity around CBDCs, central bank digital currencies, correlated to the rise of crypto as a phenomenon. And so I'm curious where CBDCs fit into all of this in your thinking. Is this more, finite commodity theory shenanigans? I won't prejudice it any further.
CBDCs are totally separate from they're in a totally different universe to things like Bitcoin, and there's no connection between them. It's very, very important to state that there's no connection between them, because what happened when CBDCs were coming out was a lot of journalists, they saw sort of new monetary things happening, and they kind of lumped them all together. They were like, oh, CBDCs, stable coins, Bitcoin, and then they would kind of like put them into the introduction of each article they were writing. Oh, these like new things are happening. But this is like really like muddy thinking. It's not what's actually happening. CBDC is something that's happening due to inherent processes in the normal monetary system. All right. It's not because of Bitcoin. It's not because of, central bankers are concerned that Bitcoin will somehow make inroads into transactions or something. Anybody who walks around society will see that Bitcoin's not used for transactions. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work this out. It's like incredibly obvious. So it's not like a central banker cares about Bitcoin. All right. The only people who care about Bitcoin in the government really tend to be people like consumer protection people. They're like, okay, we don't want people to be like screwed overtly, or maybe sometimes like, enforcement authorities, they kind of care about it, but central bankers don't care about it at all. They see it as a sideshow. CBDC is something that's occurring because, at least partially because of the decline of the cash system. As I mentioned earlier, the digital money that we use when we're doing cashless payments is basically, think about it as being like digital casino chips issued out by the banking sector. So if you're thinking about the monetary system, you've got to see it in layers. So the first layer is a state layer, and that's what we experience as cash. The second layer is the bank layer. That's what you see in your bank accounts. And that's the sort of second form of money issued out by the banking sector. They issue it out when you give them cash, but also when they're giving out loans, right? So sometimes it's called fractional reserve banking, or more accurately referred to as credit creation of money. When banks are issuing loans, they're just pushing out these new chips into society, all right? So a large portion of our money supply comes from the banking sector issuing out these digital casino chips, basically. And historically, there's been a balance of power between the physical state money and digital bank money, right? But in the context of cashless society, or the rise of that balance of power is being upset. And that's has financial stability implications. And so central banks start to think about, if there is a proper decline in the cash system, how will we provide a new layer one form of money in digital form? Right? And that was the debates around CBDC. And this, particularly in the context of the pandemic, they started thinking about it as well, because there was a big decline in transactional usage of cash. So they started to think a lot more about it in the context of the pandemic. That happened to also get weaponized by the populist right wing, who started to use this as one of the stories about this new looming form of digital state control, which in the context of COVID, when there were other forms of state control, had a certain kind of, it worked well with the population, right? But the people who actually control the digital money system is not the state, it's the banking sector. The banking sector and Visa and MasterCard and big tech control the digital money system. It's not the state. And they've been doing surveillance on that forever, right? So digital money surveillance is already a reality, and the state does not need its own digital currency to do that. It could just use the banking sector for that. It already does use the banking sector for that. So the story came out that somehow CBDC was an attempt to try and take over our lives and our payments and so on. This is why Trump then put out this thing being like, we'll never have a CBDC and so on. So there's this whole kind of like side story developed about CBDC being this kind of authoritarian thing. The reality is way more banal. CBDC was a kind of structural type of thing in the context of the decline of the cash system. And then there's been this added thing now with stable coins where I can go into that as well, but that's a kind of third layer system. So if you have layer 1 systems, state, layer 2 systems, bank, layer 3 systems, things like PayPal and stablecoins. And so stablecoins became a kind of another topic. And stablecoins are authentically quite disruptive because they're basically these sort of third layer vouchers for US dollars that have none of the traditional rules that bank accounts have. So actually stablecoins are actually quite like concerning for authorities in a way that Bitcoin isn't, right? Because stablecoins have the actual potential for people actually using them for transactions, right? So yeah, I could go more into that, but the the rise of CBDC has got nothing directly to do with Bitcoin at all.
Yeah, other than narratively, of course, which is the point you're making.
And it remains at a kind of theoretical level. They're sort of experimenting with it. Bear in mind that CBDC already exists. Banks do get to use digital state money between themselves. That's what we call reserves. So the CBDC debate is whether or not you open up the reserve system, the digital state money system, to the public. All right. Banking sector hates this idea because it will basically disintermediate them. Right. This is why the banking sector has been heavily lobbying against CBDC, because they basically know it's like, hey, right now you got a Bank of America app, for example. Hey, maybe you can just download a US Federal Reserve account and use that instead. And now you've got this direct form of state money you can use. So actually, from a kind of that might actually happen. So the banks have done a lot to lobby against CBDC because they're worried about it undermining their own business models.
Got it. Makes total sense. Okay, so I before we get, I want to get to the stablecoin bit. I want to come back to the post-growth degrowth bit. I know we've been going for a while, so I want to make sure you have time to get to those two topics. Cool. Before we go there, we have a kind of there's like a threaded comment across a few different this person, the million things, left a kind of like daisy chain comment. So I'm gonna read it, and I think your squirrel and oak tree bit hits some of this, but just in case there's more. So they write, I've spent a ton of time analogizing back and forth between ecosystems and economies, trying to understand what the best analog is for money in an ecosystem. I tried to think of it in terms of the water cycle for a while, but found it ultimately poor. Seems to me now that nutrient flows are a much better analog. What are your thoughts on that line of thinking? And then the final bit, nutrient flows in ecosystems don't have a creditor class. Organisms receive nutrients/credit. It's their existence, and it flows outward from the bottom up as the system complexifies.
I mean, I think it's an interesting metaphor in terms of if you're trying to articulate a different monetary system, maybe. I wouldn't use it to describe our current monetary system. I would use nervous systems if I was looking for a biological metaphor for money. Like nervous systems, by far, the best. Traditionally, in modern economics, they use substance-based metaphors. Blood or water are the most common. Again, this comes from commodity theories of money. They try to imagine that money is a sort of substance in itself, a kind of substance of value that flows around the economy. And in that kind of model, banks can also then present themselves as being kind of like these organs that sort of push the money around and help the economy to receive, nutrients in a sense. And so they use a lot of that kind of substance metaphors, which I would heavily recommend never using personally for money. The best way to think about money is nervous systems, in the sense that the nervous system can activate things into action. They require other things. So if you think about, for example, like your motor cortex, I mean, I'm not an expert in, brain stuff, but your motor cortex essentially translates thought into action, right? So I can do this by creating thoughts that then move my muscles, right? Well, the muscles are doing the moving, but the neural impulses can trigger that, right? And in a similar way, money has that kind of vibe to it, right? In a large scale interdependent system, the actual like body of the economy, as it were, as like human beings and actual resources. But you can have these systems of, well, really systems of credit, right? That come to act like a nervous system. So you can trigger people into action through units of money. And through this metaphor, you can start to think about the financial sector as being kind of like a central nervous system that has this ability to trigger large-scale action, right? So, I can go down to the shop, for example, with a bit of some cash in my wallet, and I can trigger small-scale action in the system. But to trigger very, very large-scale action, you have these big financial players who can basically make thousands of human bodies move and do things. So yeah, that's the metaphor that I would personally use to think about money. But of course, if you're trying to think about building alternative monetary systems, and you wanted to articulate some kind of positive vision, using natural systems as a metaphor can work, right? So potentially the nutrient flows can be used, but I would caution against making a category error between the actual source of value in an economy, which is the actual human beings and resources, and the systems you use to coordinate that, right? So in the end, the sort of nutrient really are people and stuff. But you can design a more healthy nervous system, for example. You can design a less concentrated nervous system, a more decentralized nervous system, a nervous system that kind of prioritizes more positive actions rather than negative actions. So that's what I'd say.
Mycelial networks. But okay, so going back to stablecoins, one, we have a couple comments from Michael Mezzatesta, who I assume you have encountered out in the wild, but if not, y'all need to talk. Great economic thinker as well, who first says, I disagree, Brett. You're definitely an expert in brain stuff. But then north of that in the chat is a question about stablecoins. So he writes, are banks worried about stablecoins as well, or do they like them? So over to you on stablecoins.
I mean, it's complex, right? Because if you think about the monetary system as a tiered system, most stablecoin providers, at least originally, had to have bank accounts, right? So, okay, very, very high level, you have your monetary layer 1 states, right? But then your monetary layer 2 is much bigger because banks have the ability to basically expand. They can issue out way more chips than they have in reserves, right? That's what's called fractional reserve banking. Basically, they can issue out loads of these chips to extract loan assets back from society. And that's what the banking business models are, which means in the money supply, your layer 2 system is way bigger than your layer 1 system. And then the layer 3 system doesn't have that ability to do that. It has to be one-to-one back. So stuff like PayPal, for example, they're not able to do, they legally are required to have either bank accounts behind them with units in those bank accounts, or be holding things like US dollar bonds, for example, that are highly liquid. And the same thing for stablecoins. They have to basically hold these, have bank accounts in the background. So theoretically, if our entire payment system shifted to stablecoins, there would still be banks in the background, right? They would still be there doing the plumbing for the stablecoin companies, but they wouldn't necessarily be directly interacting with the public. That's not about to happen, but that's the sort of like a scenario for banks, is that they could lose the customer-facing element of their business, which could affect them in various ways, right? So in the sense, that's what they're concerned about. I don't know if you followed the Libra debates that happened a few years ago, and there were all these kind of like ridiculous articles that came out from various places saying like, oh, Libra is about to disintermediate central banks and stuff. It was kind of ridiculous because if you looked at the design of Libra, it was entirely based upon the central banking system. They basically had to be holding various reserves in the central banking system and moving them around. The big problem was that there was sort of this lack of transparency in how that would happen, right? So it's not like the layer 3 system can detach from the layers underneath it that underpin it, right? So stablecoins, PayPal, these are layer 3 systems. They depend upon the layer two systems. They can't exist independently. So that's a big thing. One of the big things that's happening with stablecoins right now is that the Trump government wants to use them to extend US dollar hegemony in a world where dollar hegemony is potentially declining, right? Because of various things, which are kind of complex to go into. But if you're wanting to look for a new avenue to promote US dollar hegemony in the world, pushing out US dollar stablecoins is one way to do it. Try and create currency substitution in countries that have other currencies, right? So I'm from Zimbabwe. My family's from Zimbabwe, for example. Zimbabwe dollarized as an economy due to hyperinflation there. So they started using the US dollar. But when that first happened, it was very hard to do it because basically the Zimbabwean government had to bring in US dollar cash into the country to then have this cash circulate. Something like a stablecoin is way, way easier to do that with, right? So it's way, way easier to do this currency substitution with stablecoins. So this means countries around the world could start to have their own currencies undermined by US dollar stablecoins in a way that's very, very dangerous for them, right? And Stephen Myron, for example, wants that. Like, that's part of the strategy for maintaining US dollar hegemony, especially in a world, and I don't want to get too complex here, but especially in a world where the dollar as a reserve system potentially is going to decline. So yeah, one of the kind of Trump things is to try to like destroy US trade deficits, but trade deficits are kind of partially required to if the US dollar is to stay as a reserve currency. But I'm aware that as I'm saying this is getting into territory that might make people's brains start to fry.
Well, all of this is electrifying.
But yeah, the way to think about stablecoins right now is to just think about them as part of the US dollar imperial strategy. A new way to sort of extend dollar hegemony in the world, right? And yeah, does that make sense?
Absolutely. And if I'm understanding you correctly, the risk is to the layer two, the Visas, the MasterCards, the Bank of Americas of the world, in losing the surveillance aspects of the customer-facing side of money.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Visa doesn't necessarily care. Visa makes its money from telling different banks or telling different institutions who's trying to move money to who. So they don't care if it's necessarily banks. They just want entities that need coordination. That's what Visa's business model is. You know, one of the most fascinating stories right now, if you want to look at like global geopolitics, is Brazil's PIX system. So Brazil designed a new digital payment system called PIX. Basically, the government forced the banks to do it. And it's to say, hey, you need to design a system between yourselves that will bypass Visa and MasterCard. So basically, citizens in Brazil can have digital payments without going through Visa and MasterCard. Because, of course, if you're Brazil, you don't want to be subject to two American corporations sitting between every interaction in your country, right? So Visa and MasterCard are part of the US geopolitical strategy. They have been for a long time. And they've been lobbying heavily the Trump government to do something about PIX. This is one of the reasons why Trump is attacking Brazil, right? Is the PIX system. They don't want this any types of autonomy. And Lula in Brazil, for example, is talking with Modi in India. Like, so the BRICS countries are starting to talk to each other to say, we should actually start to form our own systems that don't rely upon American corporations. Because in the long term, you know, we don't want Visa and MasterCard sitting between every one of our citizens' transactions. So this is part of the broader picture of monetary geopolitics right now.
Any other before the final chunk of post-growth, degrowth questions, any other financial geopolitical happenings that are worth calling out, like the way PIX was?
Probably many, but right now I'm not sure. You mean monetary wise, or?
Yeah, monetary wise.
I mean, those are probably the main ones right now. Yeah, I mean, I'm based here in Europe, so There's a sort of debate going on in Europe about whether the sort of Eurozone should have a kind of try to promote its CBDC as some kind of the US is using a private sector approach to extend dollar hegemony right now. They say, like, let's get all these stablecoin companies to go around the world and promote US dollar stablecoins, which will then, in the long term, also mean that those stablecoin companies have to back themselves with liquid assets, which creates a new source of buying power for the US bond market. Right, because all these big stablecoin companies have to hold bonds in the background. So this is part of the dynamic is that, right? And the Eurozone's now sort of sitting there being like, okay, we're stuck between the US and China because China has all its own systems it's building. And so the Eurozone's kind of like flailing around trying to figure out what they're going to do. And so they're trying to go with the digital euro as their kind of flagship project, which is this CBDC project. But it's very kind of like half-hearted and sort of people aren't very enthusiastic about it. That's as much as I have to say right now. There's probably many more things that are escaping my mind.
Yeah, no, and for that, folks should follow Asimoko to get your latest takes on the various happenings as they happen. So, final conversational bucket: post-growth, degrowth. What are your thoughts?
I mean, post-growth is a kind of a vague concept. A bit like post-capitalism. There's sort of like more, I guess, sort of things that are sort of left there for the imagination to fill in. Right? Now, I guess post-capitalism has always been something that stands a little bit in opposition to anti-capitalism, right? Because in some hard left communities, you find more like anti-capitalist thought, which is like, we try to sort of attack capitalist institutions. Post-growth, post-capitalist thought is a bit more flexible, maybe, in the sense that it offers a route for people who potentially aren't anti-capitalist to start thinking. It's like, okay, how do we move beyond something? So it has a kind of quasi-evolutionary type of vibe to it, where it's saying, we move beyond, like you move from a teenager to being an adult, you move into this post type of system. So I think it's interesting. I don't always know that there's a sort of coherent plan of how that happens necessarily, but I like it as a sort of generic concept to sort of steer a debate potentially. The Post-Growth Institute, I don't know if you know Donnie McClurkin and stuff like so they do work on that kind of stuff. So I haven't been following what they've been doing recently, what their latest sort of articulation of it is. In terms of degrowth, degrowth I always find interesting, but I don't like the name degrowth personally, because I feel like it has a weakness in how it's positioned. Going back to that point I was making earlier about articulating an alternative progress narrative, I feel like the word degrowth tends to buy into and then reject an existing progress narrative. So it sort of says we're not growth, rather than articulating what it is. And it sort of fixates on what it isn't, rather than foregrounding what it is. So, me and my friend Julio have often talked about this. We when we're talking to each other, we call it re-leisure or re-leisure. I don't know how you say it in the US. Like something. So you deprioritizing endless production and reprioritizing rest, for example. Reprioritizing time with your family. Reprioritizing walking in the wilderness rather than just exploiting it. Right? So you're talking about, I would rather frame degrowth in RE terms. So I think maybe that's an interesting sort of spur for people to say, what is the alternative value set that you're promoting with it? I feel like degrowth is too politically easy to attack in a world where people are primed to, whether they like it or not, to imagine that growth is good. And it's partly to do with this. These progress narratives are structured as singular tracks. So you have, the way I sometimes talk about it is with senses. So, sight, hearing, taste, touch. a single track concept of progress, it's a bit like fixating upon sight, for example, and saying we want to maximize sight, right? And if you go against that, they say, oh, you want to promote blindness, all right? So that's a bit like degrowth. It's like we want to go against the maximization impulse, but then the attack that comes back from them is like, oh, you want us to be like hobbled with like nothing and all this kind of stuff. Whereas it's way better to say, hey, I want to promote hearing, or I want to promote taste, or I want to rebalance the balance between those senses. All right. Then it becomes way more compelling for people. It's like, oh, yeah, actually, you're right. We shouldn't just fixate on a singular concept of maximization. We should think about how do we balance things rather than merely maximize things. And in that context, I think degrowth becomes very powerful if you reframe it. Because most human beings can understand the need to have balance, all right? But I feel like that word D doesn't say that. It kind of keeps you in that sort of singular path thinking.
I really appreciate that. Super, super lucid and good notes for those of us thinking about, the need for alternative economic narratives to factor in. I have kept you for over 90 minutes. So I don't feel like I have time for my recurring questions. So I'm going to hope that I can have you back on the show for another episode sometime, maybe in 2026. In the meantime, if you just wanted to say a few quick words about what you have coming up at Asimoko. I know you've been doing this ongoing course, Intro to Economic Life. Anything you have that you wanted to call out for folks to keep an eye on?
I'm upping my video game. So I've been spending a lot of time learning how to make my videos way better than before. So that's something that's going on. But yeah, no, I'm excited for the new year. For those of you who don't know Asimoko, it has a few different tracks. I have stuff around cash. I have stuff around the monetary system. I have stuff around technology and capitalism. Also do some geeky stuff around kind of anthropology. I do a lot of economic anthropology stuff. So yeah, I'm going to keep those tracks going. And that's basically me. Yeah. Working my videos. And I do have a course on there, which is about economic anthropology and approaching global capitalism through the lens of economic anthropology, because I'm kind of coming out of this traditional people like David Graeber. I don't know if you know David Graeber, but this is kind of, I'm sort of team economic anthropology in many ways.
He's the GOAT. R.I.P. R.I.P. to a great one. But fortunately, we have folks like you carrying the mantle. And Brett, I really appreciate this. This has been super illuminating for me. I had expectations coming in, and you exceeded all of them. So thanks for taking the time.
It's fun. Thanks for having me on, man. Let's keep in touch.
All right. Keep in touch. Talk soon.
All right. Cheers, man. All right.
Bye.